Man, let me tell you something what's happening right now in the media landscape. I've been around long enough to see scandals, see trust rise and fall. But this thing with Charlie Kirk, it's like a nuke just went off in the middle of the news industry. For decades, these people, legacy networks, the big glossy magazines, the so-called paper of record, they've strutted around like referees in the game of truth. They decide who's inbounds, who's out of bounds, who you're allowed to listen to, who gets silenced. And the whole time, they've built their identity on this illusion. We don't make mistakes. We don't have bias. We're the guardians of democracy. But then, boom, Charlie Kirk gets assassinated, and their masks slip. And not just a little slip, not like a, oops, we got the date wrong kind of mistake. I'm talking about the whole mask falling off, cracking on the floor, revealing what's underneath. These people went from pretending to be professional truth tellers to exposing themselves as bitter, vindictive political hacks in the span of a few hours. Now, I don't want this to get twisted. Charlie was a young guy. He had his whole life ahead of him. And regardless of what anyone thinks of his politics, that assassination was tragic. A life cut short, a family destroyed, that's real pain. This isn't about celebrating any of that. But what it revealed about the people who control information in this country, that's a story that affects every single one of us. Because here's what happened. Within hours of the assassination, the big networks were already out there spinning. They weren't mourning. They weren't calling for peace. They weren't reflecting on how political rhetoric has gotten too heated. No. They were doing what they always do, trying to steer the narrative to fit their worldview. I watched one cable host, again, I'm not giving him the satisfaction of saying his name, basically blame Charlie for his own death. Minutes after it happened, he's on TV suggesting that Kirk's rhetoric contributed to the violence. Think about how insane that island a guy gets killed in broad daylight. And the first instinct from people who claim to be journalists is to victim blame him on national television. Another columnist from one of the so-called elite papers took it even further. She twisted Kirk's past statements, ripped them out of context, painted him as a racist posthumously, like the guy's not even around to defend himself anymore, and they're still trying to bury his reputation 6 feet deeper. That was the moment people realized, oh, wait, these aren't neutral observers, these aren't referees, these are players in the game, and they're not even hiding it anymore. For years, conservatives and independents have been saying the media is biased. And for years, a lot of folks just shrugged. Like, come on, they can't all be crooked. They can't all be that agenda-driven. Well, now they've seen it. Clear as day. You don't need a media critic to spell it out. When you watch someone dance on the grave of a political opponent, you instantly understand who they are. And millions of Americans got that clarity at the exact same time. Here's where it gets wild. The media thought they'd control the fallout. They've been doing this forever, right? Run the same playbook, drown the audience in commentary, shove the narrative down their throats, and move on before people can ask too many questions. But this time, something unexpected happened. Charlie Kirk's digital presence exploded. His personal accounts, millions of new followers in a matter of days. His wife's accounts, same thing. Turning Point USA's platforms, they were adding followers so fast you could literally watch the numbers tick up minute by minute. And it wasn't just Americans. This thing went international. I'm talking Hungary, Poland, Eastern Europe, places where people know what it feels like to have your speech controlled, your freedoms strangled. Folks from those countries were messaging Turning Point, asking how they could start their own chapters. They saw what happened. They saw the reaction from the so-called free press, and they went, yeah, we recognize that move. We've lived it. That's the irony here. The media thought they could kill Charlie Kirk's movement by trashing him even after death. Instead, they supercharged it. It's the Streisand effect on steroids. The harder they tried to smear him, the bigger his message spread. And the networks, they weren't ready for that. They weren't ready to be exposed in real time to millions of people who used to trust them. Suddenly, they're firing producers, pulling commentators off the air, issuing half-baked apologies. Can you even believe that? Legacy media actually apologizing. That never happens. They'll spend years defending lies. Hell, some of them are still pretending they didn't screw up stories from the Iraq War era. But here, with Charlie Kirk, they're scrambling because they know they went too far and the public caught them. Think about the magnitude of this. We're talking about institutions that survived Nixon, survived the internet revolution, survived Trump, survived social media fact-checking, and now, suddenly, they're bleeding credibility so fast they can't patch the holes. The assassination wasn't just an attack on one man. It was the spark that lit the bonfire under the legacy press. And the ripple effects, they're only starting. Because once trust is gone, it doesn't come back. You can rebuild a house after a fire, but it's never the same house. The foundation is scorched. And the foundation of trust between the American people and their media, that's ash right now. What we're watching is more than a stumble. It's not a scandal they'll weather, not just another bad news cycle. This is systemic failure in front of everyone's eyes. The gatekeepers lost the keys, and people are realizing they don't need permission to access information anymore. So here's the takeaway. Charlie Kirk's assassination was tragic, yes. But what it revealed, the arrogance, the bias, the cruelty of our media elites, might end up reshaping the entire information ecosystem. Millions of Americans who used to casually flip on the evening news or skim the morning paper just had their eyes opened. And once you see the machine for what it is, you can't unsee it. Man, you got to understand the scale of what happened here. Before Charlie's death, Turning Point USA was big, yeah, but not this big. Hundreds of chapters, some national name recognition, enough to annoy the media class, but it wasn't keeping network executives up at night. They probably saw him as a blip, another young conservative voice who'd either mellow out, sell out, or just fade into the background once the system warmed down. That's the playbook, right? Wait long enough and the fire goes out. But here's what they didn't count on. Tragedy transforming into momentum. Within a week of his assassination, TPUSA wasn't just growing, it was detonating. Tens of thousands of applications to start new chapters came flooding in. Not hundreds, not a couple thousand, tens of thousands. That's the kind of growth curve startups dream about. Imagine multiplying your entire reach 20 times over in the span of days. And this wasn't just American students filling out forms. This was global. You had young people from countries with recent histories of authoritarianism, Eastern Europe, Latin America, even some in Asia, reaching out and saying, we want in. We want this message of freedom, critical thinking, and courage on our campuses. That's when you realize Charlie Kirk didn't just die, he was martyred in the eyes of millions. And martyrdom has a strange power that the elites never seem to understand. You try to silence someone by force, and 9 times out of 10, you amplify them instead. His voice may have been cut off, but his influence, it grew louder than ever. Meanwhile, what was happening to the networks that rushed to smear him? Ratings were falling off a cliff. Advertisers were pulling spots. Their own audiences were turning on them. Social media was flooded with clips of the most tasteless, biased, and smug coverage they had produced in years. The internet never forgets, and this time it wasn't fringe critics digging through the archives. It was average people, moms, dads, college students, office workers, clipping, sharing, memeing, and saying this is who these people really are. The contrast couldn't have been more brutal. On one side, a dead young man whose organization was multiplying like wildfire. On the other, institutions with billion-dollar infrastructures, decades of brand equity, suddenly hemorrhaging credibility, bleeding trust faster than they could plug the leaks. And that's when something happened we've never really seen before in modern American media. Firings. Not the kind of firings you're used to where some anchor gets caught in a personal scandal or a producer tanks the ratings. No, these were ideological firings. Executives realizing in real time that their employees had been too honest about their bias, too naked about their contempt for half the country. Remember that cable news pundit who practically blamed Charlie for his own death, saying his rhetoric contributed to the violence? That clip spread like wildfire. Phones were blowing up. Advertisers didn't want to be anywhere near it. Social feeds were full of disgust. And the network, which normally would have circled the wagons and defended their guy to the bitter end, did something shocking. They cut him loose, fired, gone. And once one domino fell, the whole row started tumbling. Over at one of the most prestigious newspapers in the country, you know, the one that still calls itself the paper of record, a columnist twisted Charlie's words to paint him as a racist in death. It was disgusting. People pulled the receipts, posted the full clips, and proved she had deliberately taken him out of context. Her response? Double down, cry racism, play the victim, the oldest trick in the book. But this time, it didn't work. The pressure was too intense, the dishonesty too obvious, and in a move that shocked even longtime media watchers, her own paper tossed her overboard, fired. Think about that for a second. This is a paper that has stood by writers who fabricated stories, who plagiarized, who botched reporting on a global scale. And yet, here, when it came to smearing Charlie Kirk, the backlash was so strong they couldn't justify keeping her. That's how radioactive this moment was. And it didn't stop there. Local anchors, radio hosts, regional columnists, people who thought they were untouchable because they had the backing of big-name outlets, were suddenly out of a job. One after another, dropping like flies, all because they couldn't contain their contempt, all because they showed the mask slipping too far in public. Now, here's where it gets almost surreal. The same networks that fired these people then had to do something they've avoided for decades: apologize. Can you even imagine? These institutions, whose whole identity is built on never admitting fault, suddenly releasing statements of regret. We didn't meet our standards. We caused unnecessary pain. We are committed to doing better. It was like watching the Titanic issue a press release apologizing for hitting the iceberg. Technically accurate, but completely meaningless. Too little, too late. Everyone could see the holes in the hull and the water rushing in. And the fired figures themselves, their reactions were pure comedy gold, if it weren't so pathetic. Instead of acknowledging they'd gone too far, instead of showing even a shred of humility, they pulled out the same tired script. I'm being silenced by right-wing extremists. This is fascism. One actually claimed his firing was proof his network was caving to Nazis. Think about that. For years, they've called conservatives fascists. And now, when they face consequences for their own cruelty, suddenly they're the oppressed ones? It was like a bizarro world inversion of reality. The self-proclaimed defenders of democracy finally getting held accountable, and their response is to cry victim. You couldn't script it better for irony. But here's the real takeaway. For decades, these people had all the power. They could smear whoever they wanted, destroy reputations, end careers, and face zero consequences themselves. They were the untouchables. But Charlie Kirk's assassination flipped the script. Suddenly, they weren't immune. Suddenly, they were accountable in a way they'd never been before. And it rattled them to their core. What scared them most wasn't just losing a few commentators or columnists. It was the realization that the public's perception of them had permanently shifted. They'd always assumed they could ride out any scandal, that people would forget. But this time, the receipts were too clear, the contrast too sharp. Everyone saw it, a young man's influence multiplying after death, while billion-dollar networks collapsed into damage control. And once the public sees that dynamic play out once, they don't forget it. The curtain has been pulled back. The Wizard of Oz is just a sweaty guy pulling levers behind a curtain. That aura of invincibility, that sense of authority, it's gone. And when the media tries to rebuild it, to puff themselves up again, people are going to laugh. They'll remember this moment. Here's the deeper point, though. This isn't just about Charlie Kirk. This is about a generational shift in how Americans understand power. Legacy media is no longer the gatekeeper. Information is decentralized. Influence is viral. And when the gatekeepers expose themselves as corrupt or biased, the people don't just notice, they revolt. They unsubscribe, they switch off, they mock, they meme. Charlie's assassination was supposed to be the end of his movement. Instead, it became a multiplier. It turned him into a symbol, and symbols are far harder to kill than people. And it turned the media into the villain in its own story. forcing them into humiliating retractions, firings, and apologies they thought they'd never have to make. That's why this is unprecedented. Not because a network anchor lost his job, not because a columnist got canned, but because the whole class of untouchables finally felt the heat of accountability, and it burned them badly. The people they mocked, dismissed, and vilified for years finally saw the power shift. And once you taste that, you don't go back. They claimed they were being persecuted for their political beliefs. They cried about being victims of a right-wing mob. They even tried to say their free speech was being violated. And this is coming from the very same people who had spent years demanding that conservatives be banned from social media, who celebrated when right-leaning voices got demonetized, who cheered when entire platforms were taken offline because they didn't fit the approved narrative. The hypocrisy was so staggering, it almost broke the sound barrier. It was breathtaking. And it wasn't just conservatives pointing it out anymore. Even some of their own allies in the media couldn't defend them. The mask had slipped too far, the ugliness was too obvious, and that sudden flash of moral clarity, that sense that the public had finally seen the game for what it was, translated into something much bigger than just media criticism. It turned into a cultural awakening. But before we get to that awakening, let's pause on the other front that was hitting the media like a freight train: legal pressure. For decades, the media operated with this smug confidence that they were untouchable when it came to the courts. They had the law on their side, or so they thought. See, public figures can't just sue you for defamation the way private citizens can. Thanks to the New York Times versus Sullivan ruling, public figures have to prove actual malice. Not just that reporting was wrong, but that it was knowingly false or published with reckless disregard for the truth. That's an insanely high bar, and it gave journalists a kind of force field. They could smear someone, misquote them, paint them in the worst possible light, and when the target sued, 9 times out of 10, the case got tossed. The system made them arrogant. It made them lazy. They knew they could twist stories with very little fear of ever paying a price. But here's where it all started to change. Trump, now, love him or hate him, you've got to acknowledge something. He never stopped fighting these battles. Even when everyone else moved on, he kept hammering at the media in court, and quietly he started winning. Not just symbolic wins, not just headline-grabbing press releases, but actual victories, settlements, judgments, tens of millions of dollars in damages. Those cases cracked the door open, and a lot of smart lawyers started looking around and realizing, hey, maybe this actual malice standard isn't as impossible to meet as we've been told. Maybe with the right evidence, emails, Slack messages, tweets, obvious patterns of bias, we can actually prove reckless disregard for the truth. And just as Charlie Kirk's assassination rocked the culture, Trump dropped a legal bombshell, a massive defamation lawsuit against the New York Times, claiming billions in damages for what he described as a coordinated campaign of lies spanning years. Think about the implications of that. If one of the biggest, most powerful news outlets in America could be held liable for billions, not millions, billions, it wouldn't just sting. It would fundamentally change the entire media business model. Suddenly, it wouldn't be profitable to smear your opponents. Suddenly, recklessness could bankrupt you. And this wasn't just about Trump. Other politicians, activists, and even ordinary citizens started filing cases emboldened by the precedent. The legal floodgates were opening, and executives in newsrooms across the country were panicking. You could practically see the meetings, lawyers telling anchors to tone it down, editors reminding reporters to verify their facts, managers whispering that maybe, just maybe, they should practice journalism again instead of activism. The timing was brutal for them. Right when they were losing credibility with the public over their coverage of Charlie's death, they also realized they could lose everything in court. But here's where it goes from legal to cultural. Because the law might force them to act carefully in print, but it was the cultural backlash that really hit home for ordinary Americans. Suddenly, people who had never thought of themselves as political were speaking out. People who had stayed quiet, avoided the debates, shrugged at the headlines, those people were now saying, wait a second, this isn't right. One of the most powerful examples came from a TV host who had always played the middle ground. Not a fire-breathing conservative, not a partisan hack, just one of those people who tries to keep balance on air. But after watching the media's behavior in the aftermath of Charlie's assassination, he snapped. On live television, with millions watching, he called out his own industry. And man, he didn't pull punches. He said what everyone had been thinking but was too afraid to say. If you spend years defending violence from one side, if you call people fascists and Nazis for simply disagreeing with you, if you demonize half the country as enemies of democracy, then you don't get to play innocent when violence finally happens. You don't get to shrug and say, both sides, you built this climate, you own it. It was brutal, and it was honest. And then he said the line that went viral, the one that cut deeper than any talking point. Charlie Kirk had a conversation, and he got shot for it. That was it. That was the moral clarity millions of Americans had been waiting for, because that's exactly what Charlie did. He had conversations. He went onto hostile campuses, into classrooms where professors despised him, into debates where he was booed. He asked questions. He listened. He responded. He had conversations. And for that, he was assassinated. When that host said those words, it broke through years of gaslighting. It gave people permission to stop playing the media's game of false equivalence. It said out loud what so many had felt in their gut. This isn't both sides. This isn't politics as usual. This is one side demonizing the other to the point where violence became inevitable. The clip went everywhere. Millions of views, shared across demographics, across party lines. Not because everyone suddenly became conservative overnight, but because it articulated a universal truth. When you justify violence with rhetoric, when you strip your opponents of their humanity, when you call them Nazis for disagreeing with you, you make bloodshed possible. That moment triggered something bigger than just anger at the media. It triggered a cultural awakening. Americans across the spectrum started rejecting not just biased reporting, but the entire worldview that made biased reporting possible. They stopped accepting the idea that legacy media gets to define morality. They stopped nodding along to talking heads who pretended that mocking or smearing half the country was somehow noble. For years, conservatives warned about the dangers of radical ideology in media, the way it poisoned institutions, the way it twisted discourse. But after Charlie's death, it wasn't just conservatives saying it anymore. Independents, moderates, even liberals who still had a shred of intellectual honesty started saying, enough. This has gone too far. It disturbed, and that was the real revolution. Because once the spell of media authority is broken, once people see the hypocrisy up close, they don't forget it. They don't go back to blind trust. They start asking questions. They start looking for alternatives. The apologies from media outlets, the firings, the lawsuits, they were symptoms. The deeper shift was cultural, a mass awakening where millions of Americans realized the people claiming to tell us the truth don't actually respect us, and they don't deserve our trust. That's the ground shaking under our feet right now. And it all started because the media's mask slipped at the worst possible moment. But many Americans, especially older generations who remembered a time when political disagreements could be tough, but civil, had a hard time believing things had really gotten this bad. They'd watch the shouting matches on cable news, they'd see the social media fights, but deep down they thought, this is noise. Things aren't really that far gone. Charlie Kirk's assassination shattered that illusion. Suddenly, millions of Americans who had tried to stay above the fray were forced to look reality in the face. They couldn't ignore it anymore. They saw firsthand how quickly supposed journalists transformed into political activists. They saw how eagerly these commentators victim-blamed a young man who had been murdered for his beliefs. And beyond that, they saw the broader pattern, the years of conditioning that led to this moment. The endless headlines labeling conservatives as Nazis, fascists, or threats to democracy. The casual celebration of political violence when it hit the right targets. The smug way institutions, universities, Hollywood, even certain churches had been captured by ideologies that viewed disagreement not as part of democracy, but as heresy. Charlie's death made it all undeniable, and you could see the reaction, especially among younger Americans, college students, high schoolers, kids who had grown up in classrooms where conservatives were presented as backward, hateful, or even dangerous. For years, they absorbed that messaging. Many believed it, until they saw the way the media treated Charlie Kirk in death. Here was a guy barely older than them who dedicated his life to empowering young people to think critically, to challenge orthodoxy, to ask hard questions. That's it. That was his crime. For that, he was demonized, threatened, and finally assassinated. The contrast between his actual message and the cartoon villain version painted by the media was so stark that even many left-leaning students couldn't defend it. For the first time, they started asking if they lied about him. Who else have they lied about? Parents were having conversations they never thought they'd need to have, explaining to their kids that the institutions they once trusted, the evening news, universities, even certain churches, weren't the neutral arbiters of truth they pretended to be. Grandparents were explaining to their grandkids, look, the people running these institutions don't necessarily share your values. Some of them don't even respect your right to think differently. And here's the thing. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't theoretical. The cultural shift was being driven by concrete events that ordinary Americans could see with their own eyes. They saw the mass firings of media figures who had laughed at Charlie's death or twisted his words. They saw the obvious double standards. Political violence downplayed when conservatives were the victims, magnified when conservatives were the perpetrators. They saw institutions that claimed to champion tolerance and diversity consistently punish anyone who dared to express a conservative opinion. Moderate Americans, people who never thought of themselves as political, who maybe even leaned left, suddenly realized they had more in common with Charlie Kirk than with the people who demonized him. They might not have agreed with every policy he supported, but they recognized his basic humanity. They saw that he had the right to speak without fear of being shot. They saw his genuine desire to help young people think for themselves. That recognition, that instinctive human recognition, was more powerful than any speech or op-ed could ever be. It struck people in the gut, and that's what truly terrified the media establishment. Because here's the deeper issue. This wasn't just about money or ratings or even lawsuits. This was about the collapse of moral authority. See, for decades, the media wasn't just reporting the news. They were defining reality. They were the arbiters of truth in American society. They decided which stories mattered, which didn't. Who was credible, who wasn't. They didn't just tell you what happened. They told you what to think about what happened. And that power didn't come from a Democratic vote. Nobody elected CNN or the New York Times to be the referees of truth. Their authority came from scarcity. In the old days, when information was hard to get, you had no choice but to trust a handful of outlets. If you wanted to know what was happening in the world, you went to them. But that world doesn't exist anymore. Charlie Kirk's assassination marked the moment when this became undeniable. Within hours of his death, more people were getting accurate information about who he really was and what he actually stood for, from independent journalists, from podcasts, from social media posts than from all the major networks combined. And what did the legacy outlets do? They didn't inform. They didn't pause. They didn't reflect. They spun. They excused. They smeared. They danced on his grave. That was the mass slipping. It revealed what many Americans had suspected but hadn't fully seen. These institutions see themselves as political actors first, journalists second. Their loyalty isn't to truth or accuracy or even basic decency. It's to their ideological agenda. And when that agenda conflicts with humanity, with empathy, with respect, they pick the agenda every time. That's why the panic you see in media boardrooms right now isn't really about revenue, though the financial collapse is real. It's about something deeper. It's about the recognition that they've lost the one thing they could never afford to lose, the trust of the American people. Because credibility once shattered is almost impossible to rebuild. And they didn't just chip away at their credibility in the aftermath of Charlie's assassination. They obliterated it. When millions of Americans watched journalists laugh, smirk, or blame Charlie for his own death, they saw the truth. They saw that these weren't neutral referees. They weren't truth seekers. They weren't watchdogs holding the powerful accountable. They were activists in suits using their platforms to push an agenda. And here's the kicker. Once people see that clearly, the game is over. The fear you see in the public apologies, the panic behind the mass firings, the desperate tone of their coverage, that's not about avoiding one bad week of ratings. That's about realizing they've permanently lost their ability to define reality for the rest of us. Without that power, what are they? Just another set of political activists, and not particularly effective ones. And they know it. That's why the fear feels so raw. They understand this isn't just a temporary backlash, it's generational. Young Americans who grew up trusting CNN or the Washington Post are now seeing those outlets for what they really are. And once that trust is broken, it doesn't come back. Not in 5 years, not in 50. Executives know they may have lost not just today's viewers, but entire future generations. And that's the kind of loss you can't put a price tag on. Charlie Kirk's assassination was supposed to be another opportunity for them to demonize conservatives, to frame the narrative, to advance their agenda. Instead, it became the moment when their masks slipped so completely, so grotesquely, that even their allies couldn't defend them. And that, my friends, is why they're terrified. And all of this circles back to Charlie himself, because his impact is now larger than life. And that terrifies them more than anything else. Here's what the media establishment never understood about Charlie Kirk and what they're finally being forced to confront now. He wasn't just another political commentator or activist. He was a symbol of something much larger and far more powerful than any individual. Charlie's real threat to the established order wasn't his particular policy positions, though those certainly rattled them. It was his fundamental message, his call for students to stop accepting what they were told at face value. He dared to tell young Americans, you don't have to take your professor's word as gospel. You don't have to swallow whatever line the media feeds you. You don't have to conform to the script handed down by institutions that see you as a pawn. You can ask questions. You can explore different perspectives. You can come to your own conclusions. That message was revolutionary because it struck at the very heart of how the system maintains control. Institutions thrive when people accept information passively, when they stop questioning, when they stop thinking critically. Charlie was challenging an entire generation to wake up and refuse that passivity. His assassination was meant to end that threat. The people who celebrated his death, who mocked him, who immediately started rationalizing the violence they thought killing Charlie would kill his message. They couldn't have been more wrong. Instead, his death amplified his message in ways that no one could have predicted. Millions of Americans who had never even heard his name before suddenly wanted to know who was he and what did he stand for. They discovered that the young man they'd been told was a dangerous extremist was actually pushing students to read more, think more, and even question him. That's the part the media never understood. Charlie wasn't telling kids to think like him. He was telling them to think, period. And that's the most subversive act of all in a culture built on conformity. Look at the aftermath. The explosion of new Turning Point USA chapters. Tens of thousands of applications flooding in within a week. Not hundreds, tens of thousands. Interest pouring in, not just from American colleges and high schools, but from overseas, from young people in nations that know the taste of authoritarianism and want to guard against it. The media establishment never anticipated this. They wanted Charlie erased. Instead, they created a martyr. And martyrs are more powerful than any living activist could ever be. But Charlie's legacy extends beyond one organization or one movement. His assassination became the catalyst for a broader awakening. Millions of ordinary Americans, people who always said, I don't do politics, I just focus on my family, my work, my community, were forced to realize something. The fight was coming for them, whether they wanted it or not. The same institutions that demonized Charlie would eventually demonize anyone who refused to conform. The same cultural machine that justified his murder would eventually justify silencing anyone who dared to stand in the way. That realization was sobering, and it sparked something unprecedented. We began to see a mass movement, not just of conservatives, but of people across the spectrum, liberals, moderates, independents, who understood that if a young man could be assassinated simply for encouraging students to think, then no one was truly safe. The media figures issuing their desperate apologies understand this dynamic, even if they'll never say it out loud. They know Charlie's death didn't kill his influence, it supercharged it. They know that every time they try to downplay the outrage, every time they tell Americans to move on, they only prove Charlie's point that they are exactly the kinds of authoritarians he warned against. Charlie Kirk accomplished in death what might have taken decades to achieve in life. He tore the mask off institutions that had pretended to be neutral referees. He exposed them as activists with press passes. And he inspired millions of Americans, maybe for the first time in their lives, to reject those institutions permanently. So what does this mean for the future of media, politics, and culture? Let's bring it together. Charlie Kirk's assassination marks a fundamental turning point. We've watched institutional credibility collapse on a scale that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. We've seen supposedly untouchable media figures lose their jobs, not because of ratings or scandals, but because their arrogance and bias became indefensible. We've watched the legal landscape shift in ways that finally make these outlets accountable for their lies and defamation. Most importantly, we've seen millions of Americans, especially young Americans, wake up to the reality of what these institutions are and what they've always been. Political actors pretending to be journalists, and here's the kicker, this shift isn't temporary. This isn't going to blow over after the next election cycle. This is permanent. Once people see the mask slip, once they see how these outlets really operate, there's no going back. That's why you're seeing the panic. That's why you're seeing the firings, the apologies, the sudden soul searching. They know the game is up. They know the credibility that took decades to build has been shattered in a single moment. And credibility, once lost, rarely comes back. Charlie's message is now bigger than ever. His organization is exploding with growth. His words are being shared more widely than they ever were when he was alive. And his story has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power. This isn't just a story about media bias or about one man's tragic death. It's a story about the power of ideas and about how courage, even in the face of violence, can reshape an entire culture. Charlie Kirk's legacy is proof that when ordinary Americans see the truth clearly, they'll always choose freedom over conformity, courage over fear, and independent thought over blind obedience. And the institutions that mocked him, smeared him, and celebrated his death, they've learned a hard lesson. There are still lines you cannot cross without consequences. Celebrating the assassination of a young man who only wanted students to think for themselves, that was one of those lines. And now, they're paying the price. So let me leave you with this. Charlie's story isn't just about him. It's about all of us. It's about whether truth, accountability, and freedom will survive in America. And I want to hear from you. Do you think legacy media is done for good, or will they find a way to claw their way back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them. And if you found this breakdown valuable, hit like, subscribe, and share this video, because we all know how fast a story like this can disappear if the wrong people decide it's too dangerous to talk about.